A very good morning to all of you. Thank you, speakers, for making it all the way from Delhi and Hyderabad on a festival day. And thank you, audience, for coming on this festival day and on a Saturday morning. We often speak about partition in numbers, millions displayed, tens of thousands murdered. But these are just numbers. Behind these numbers are lives, our stories, and our memories, which are often forgotten or just silenced. As partition living memories are fading, we are here to question whose responsibility it is on how we tell the story and what we tell. This responsibility is not just restricted to writers and historians, but to all of us. And today's panel of eminent speakers um, will have been working on these partition histories for a very long time in different medias. And we are here to explore the nuances of the ethics of storytelling and how we can pass on this to the future generation without flattening it and giving it an honest voice it deserves. So let me start with a question to both of you. What motivated you to start working on partisan histories?
I would like to begin by echoing the sense of thanks both to BIC. It's always a pleasure to be back, and to the audience for being here on a festival morning. To the question of how I begin, I have two stories to tell. On the one hand, I was at some point looking at doing something fruitful with my time, and my husband said to me that I want to have all Tagore's complete collection at home, and I'm not a reader, you are a reader, so why don't you do something about it, because it's something that I would like to have. And I thought, wow, that's a good experience. It would be nice to learn to read Tagore, not in translation but in Bangla. And while I was trying to learn the script, it hit me, if I can invest so much of energy into learning Bengali, why am I not learning Sindhi? And I've grown up speaking Sindhi, I can understand it perfectly well, I can speak it fluently. Why not do this? So that's when my linguistic track changed and I started learning. That led me to catching hold of different people who would help me read Sindhi. So wherever an auntie and an uncle I would come across, I would ask them, can you help me read this, or tell me, am I reading it correctly or not? And one lady sort of saw my enthusiasm for learning Sindhi and said, listen, my dad was an educator. He was a math tuition teacher, but had lots of books. Now that he has passed away, we are going to, we are thinking about what to do with books. And I don't know, I don't want to throw them. You look like someone who will, put them to good use. And at that point of time, I thought, wow, someone has trusted me with these books, and I have struggled because I've not been able to read books. I did not even know that Sindhi books, Sindhi writers, Sindhi poets existed. And at that point of time, I thought, what if these books were not just, restricted to me, and they were, sort of available to everyone? That is when I thought about the processes of digitization and reached out to people and started figuring out, what to do with it. The second story associated with this is when I set out to actually think of a digital archive, I mean, of an archive, I thought digitization is just one part of it. Archive would be me reaching out to people, asking them, can you name one famous Sindhi writer? Or I want to, listicles. We live in the age of listicles. Give me 5 poems or 5 stories or 5 novels that I should be reading. And everyone would say, well, there are no books and we have not read any books. We have not read any books. So what do we do? And then I thought, maybe that archive where people give their recommendations of which books to read and give their commentaries will have to wait. First, I'll have to make space for books to be made available. And that's how PG Sindhi Library happened. And after that, it has been, 3 more and a fifth one in the making. So this is how one thing leads to the other. Over to you.
That is so interesting. And thank you for that, both those lovely stories. But before I talk about my trajectory, which is completely different from Sony's, but somehow we ended up connecting with each other. I also wanted to just say thanks to BIC for this event, but also particularly thanks to Riti for the work that they've been doing these last 3 years with this really wonderful exhibition, a real resource that that is so engaging, you know, when you go and look at it, and then there are these questions that you have to answer, the decisions that you have to take. It's a really interesting way of talking to people about the complex decisions that people had to take at Partition about whether to leave or to stay, what to leave behind, what to take with them. Thank you for humanizing it so much. I have gone back to those things again and again. So my trajectory is quite different. Both my parents were partition refugees, but like all first generation partition children, I didn't pay much attention to stories of partition, which tended to live on inside our families, but found no echo in the outside world that we inhabited, where if we knew partition at all, we knew it through what we studied in school and later at university. And both of those places informed us about partition in terms merely of the politics of it, the political leaders, the political parties, the political differences, but nothing at all about the experiences that people went through. And as Tejasvi said, we knew numbers, but we did not know what lay behind the numbers. And that's so ironical, because in many of our families, what lay behind the numbers was ever present. But I think we just didn't pay it attention. I certainly didn't. And then two things happened that pushed me towards looking at partition. One of those was that some friends of mine were wanting to make a film on partition and on people's memories. And they interestingly hadn't, well, one of them hadn't actually done the depth of research that was needed for them to arrive in India and start shooting. It was an Indian and a British person, two people who wanted to do that. So they wrote to me, said, can you help us with the research? And I started to look for people who were partition survivors and to listen to their stories and to see if we could interview them for the film. And for that, I traveled a little bit in Punjab and other places. So that was one trajectory that was making me start to think of partition and the experiences that lay behind it. But much more directly then, what happened was that in 1984, when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, Delhi, the city in which I had lived all my life, or pretty much all my life, suddenly transformed into a city of terrible violence as hordes of people turned on the Sikh population. And there was just loot, arson, burning, killing. And I could no longer recognize this city, which had been my home. And there was a citizens group set up called Nagrik Ekta Manch to help the survivors of the violence. And many of us went and joined that group, and then we were all allocated certain tasks. So my task, along with the small group of which I was a part, was to work in an area across the river in Delhi called, well, the river is like a drain now, but that time it was more riverish than it is today, in a place called Shakarpur. And there my task was to take down people's testimonies so that we would have some kind of evidence for filing claims and just a record of what had happened. And it was when I started writing those down in my register that I started to properly hear stories of partition. And I started to, people kept saying, this is like partition again. We've never expected it to happen to us in our own country. And that's what pushed me to ask myself the question, why I, a child of partition, with parents who were partition survivors, each of whom brought their own refugee story into the family, had never really bothered to pay attention to what the human side of partition. And it was then that I decided to start exploring it. And I started to look for people who had lived through that time. And the interesting thing is that when you start to look and when you train a different eye from the normal eye, which often doesn't see a lot of things, really the reality in front of you changes. So then in the same city where I had grown up, the city looked different to me as I realized that places were refugee colonies, which earlier for me had just been places where people lived, and that those people there were refugees, and that the names of places like, Kingsway Camp was a camp where refugees had come, and so on, all of these things. The Purana Killa, which was just a monument, was a place which housed thousands, lakhs and lakhs of people waiting to move to Pakistan. So suddenly everything changed. And that was really what led me to start looking at partition.
Thank you for sharing your stories. Going from the personal realm into the public sphere, question to Urvashi. While you were documenting your oral histories and collecting them for The Other Side of Silence, by the way, if you haven't, I would highly, strongly recommend you read this book. It is one of the landmark books on partition. In fact, I started my research for our exhibition from this book, and it kind of laid the path for the way we wanted to kind of show partition, and exactly the way Urvishi said, the human aspects of partition, because everywhere we've heard so much about partition in the political sphere with the political lens, but nothing so much about partition from the people's point of view. So I would highly recommend you read that book. So while you were documenting, how did you balance the empathy between empathy and research rigor? And how did you keep the survivors' voices intact without making them sound into trauma tourism?
So Tejasvi, I think when you're listening to people's voices, I think we don't need to apply the same kind of checks and balances or same kind of conditions that one might do when you're doing an academic exercise. So when you speak of rigor, I'm not entirely sure how one can use the lens of rigor to examine people's voices, which are filled with emotion, with memories, with uncertainties, with ambivalences, because rigor itself carries this connotation of great clarity and, truth, simplicity, all of that. I don't think we can necessarily imply that. I think we have to understand people's voices for what they are. They are a way for them to articulate something that they have carried inside them, especially the first time people started speaking out after partition. And it wasn't only me, there were a whole lot of people doing different kinds of research, because I think it was a moment in our history when that curiosity came to the fore and when that kind of research was still possible. So I think that we have to look at it in terms of what people are looking for. They're looking for somebody who's listening, and the listening comes with empathy of understanding and not judgment. So what I think we have to exercise is a lack of judgment and not necessarily rigor. Do you see what I mean? And in some ways, the question is often also asked about people's voices or oral interviews, saying, how do you know that they are factual? How do you know that they are, within quotes, truthful? But we never ask that question of fact, that what we take as fact, how do we know that this is the truth? Because fact itself is something that has come from somebody's interpretation. So I always give this example, and if you've heard me say it before, please forgive me. But years ago, I went with a team of people to do an investigation into the anti-Muslim violence in Bhagalpur in Bihar, where a lot of Muslims had been killed, and they were mostly silk weavers who wove silk on handlooms. And the larger agenda of that seemed to be the destruction of the handloom industry, because it was the power looms that wanted to come in and big industrialists were behind it. So there's always a kind of political motivation for what happens in people's lives. And we were trying to exercise certain rigor on this, and we were trying to get figures of how many people had been killed. And we got 3 different sets of figures, one from the police, one from Sarkari officers in the administration, and one from the people. And they varied between 250 to 1,000. Now, where is the fact in that? And one of those figures is going to find its way into record as fact. Most likely, the administration's figure or the police figure, which will have been gathered from certain kind of documentation. But for the people, they may not have counted every death, but they felt about 1,000 of their people had been killed. So the truth lies somewhere between those. And the truth is really that even if one person is dead, it's one too many. So in a sense, I think the way we look at the telling of stories about our traumatic past, we have to look at them differently from the way we look at historical accounts of those traumatic pasts and what history can record. And our understanding then needs to be putting those 2 narratives together, looking at the overlaps and looking at the differences and seeing what we can learn from those together.
Building on what you pointed, Urvashi, Soni, you also in your work have faced challenges because it is fragmented. There are many, as Urvashi said, there is no one truth. There are many truths. How did you navigate and how did you decide what needs to be preserved and what should not or what can't?
I think largely the idea of working with anything related to Sindhi is the idea of working with absences. You have to take it for granted that it is relatively underexplored, voice. It's a relatively underexplored area. So for me, everything was about, okay, it's not there. Books are not there. Literature is not there. Book history, print history, these things are not there. So I have taken that for granted and then started working on it. So in the case of Sindhi, what I have done is I look at what is available, and then through different archives, through different processes, I try to understand what can be arrived at about partition itself. So yes, I think the onus has more been on the respondent in the case of oral histories and the donors in case of books, and in certain senses the people who are willing to give me family business histories or advertisements from their old books and magazines or whatever ads that they worked with, or their own stories about how they survived. They are the ones who are in fact wondering, should I share this, should I not share this, should I is this too much information, is this very little information. So I think my success or the journey has been that people are at least now opening up. They are at least trusting me with certain kinds of narratives and certain kinds of stories and giving me certain objects to take care of. And I will try to continue to be mindful of how to work with this, because erasure has been there, and I'm very very mindful of the fact that you will have to do a lot of digging, maybe 50 more years, to understand that there is a Sindhi side to it as well.
Yes.
So Soni, when we were talking earlier, you said that some of the materials that you receive often are damaged, and you might get a book which has no cover, which has no title page, or sometimes it has no way of being identified for what it is. I thought it's very interesting because, in a sense, if you're looking at history through the lens of fact, and then if you're looking at what you said, which I also found very interesting, that you're starting with absence, and then you're filling it. So whatever you can find to fill it with, even if it is an incomplete fragment, becomes really important. I just wondered if you might like to talk about those incomplete things and what do you do with them? Do you throw them away? Do you keep them? Why do you keep them?
Depending on which archive I'm talking about, the response will change. So in the question, when it comes to PG Sindhi Library, which is collection of digitized books, it looks very different. There, I say very simply not available, or I describe what I think the contents of the books are. When it comes to advertising that was published in post-partition Sindhi books and Sindhi publishing scene in India, which was actually a very interesting scene because Sahitya Academy and other kinds of big publishers were not there. So these were very small scale publishers, Ulasnagar based publishers or Mumbai based publishers that were trying to print books, and they were collecting advertisements from the businessmen to try and say that okay, let's at least cover the printing costs and the distribution costs. So wherever there the case of absence or lack of fact is also very subtle. There are a lot of advertisements where they have said Sindhi Jo Shubh Chintak, an advertisement space donated by a well-wisher. That's all. It does not say anything. That is why that archive has been very interesting. Very recently, the archive or the digital repository about locating institutions and personal collections that have Sindhi books, that has a very different kind of absence. That has people telling me, why will I share my catalog with you? In some cases, the absence comes from the fact that we do not even have the staff to record. There are to record metadata about books. There are people who Sindhi is read right to left and it's back to front, and the staff that does not understand Sindhi does not even keep books with the spine like that, because to them it just does not make sense. So even the books are not kept in a certain order the way they are supposed to be kept. With oral histories around these libraries, people come and say, we have never had anybody who is who is reading anyways. Why have you come, and why are you asking these questions? And recently, in the case of oral histories about Ulasnagar as a city, um, there are some people who say that I do not want my history to be recorded. I'm happy to talk to you. You can use what I'm saying, but do not record me. So in those cases, I have to respect what they are saying. And maybe at some point, I'll come up with a timeline myself. The website might have a timeline which will say this was the year in which illegal construction of buildings began to happen in Ulhasnagar. This was the year in which certain policy documents were promulgated. This was the year in which the first building was demolished in Ulhasnagar, and that's how it will grow. So this has been the way it's shaping up. Yeah, thank you for that question.
It's very interesting because the same questions apply, they just when you were asking how do you decide what gets represented and what doesn't. I mean, for Sony, that question works in different ways, no? Because it's also when people are reluctant to speak and they're saying, no, I'll talk to you, but don't put my history out there. And libraries are reluctant to engage with this thing. So her choices are also, in a sense, dictated by that.
Others. As a follow-up question to both of you, are there aspects which are not, which are silenced, which are not spoken about in your work? Because maybe the survivor didn't want to, or ethically, for ethical reasons, you thought best not to talk about it. If so, how did you go about making that choice?
In the case of libraries, I have a very interesting anecdote to share. This librarian was saying, yes, we have had Sindhi books, and I'm very happy to share these books with me, but I will not share them with you. Simply because you will put them up online and you are doing a good job by connecting people to Sindhi resources, and it's a very welcoming gesture. But supposing someone comes at our doorstep and asks for the book, yeah, we will not have anything to show for it, because an irony in the way policy functions is that government gives you money to buy books, but it does not give you money to preserve them. So at that point of time, I had to and he's saying the books have deteriorated, they have crumbled, they don't exist. Whom will we explain that the books don't exist? So now we understand that the acid free paper publication and printing that we are doing has these kinds of sensitivities built into it. So in that sense, yes, so in that case, I will not put up Even I will not even list the institution on my repository saying this repository has, or this location has these many books. In certain other cases, for example, in advertising and business history archive, there was this one gentleman who said that things have been, very, the joke about Ulhasnagar, if you have never heard of Ulhasnagar or met someone from Ulhasnagar, is made by USA, Ulhasnagar Sindhi Association, right? Which was a way to sort of fool people to think that this item has come from USA, but it was actually Ulhasnagar. They were saying that there is a very interesting history behind it. Yeah, things were genuinely not coming from abroad, license Raj and things like that at that point of time. And I was one of the very few people who did not compromise on the product quality. I was among, because I could afford to. My products were only getting exported. So I did not compromise on the ingredients. I did not make counterfeit goods. But Ulhasnagar is unfortunately known for counterfeit goods, right? Someday I will bump into someone who said, listen, who will say, listen, I had to cave in. And it's not like Sindhis were, doing it intentionally. Sindhis were also doing it because the brief was coming from elsewhere. People sitting, manufacturers or marketers sitting in Delhi and elsewhere were saying, we want this kind of good, but, tweak this ingredient to this bit. So in that case, I will not reveal, those stories. Yeah. So coffee bite becomes toffee bite, Parker pen becomes Parkar pen, right? These are the kinds of stories. And, really, if someone wants to share them, most welcome. I'm waiting for such stories to come out. But these are the stories that I will have to intentionally keep to myself. But there will be ways in which it will come out. That's why I also write. That's why this forum where I can, talk about these possibilities as well. Over to you.
Yeah, so of course there are a lot of stories that you silence and don't tell. For me, I think it didn't begin like that. Okay, when I entered the research, I had this kind of missionary zeal, thinking that I am going into a history which has hitherto been silenced, which has remained hidden. And it's my job as crusader to unpack these histories and put them out there, to put the truth out there. But dealing with people, talking to people about traumatic pasts, about their experience is very humbling. And you also realize that it is not about you, the crusader, but about them who's lived through the history, and you are only the person who carries that responsibility to take that history out into the public world. And that responsibility comes with a whole range of different choices and ethics also. So, as I began to hear stories of more and more trauma and difficult stories, the question about what I would reveal and what I would not reveal became increasingly urgent. So, for example, my work begins with an exploration of my own family history. And one of the people I interviewed extensively was my mother's brother, who chose to stay behind in Pakistan, who became a Muslim, married a Muslim woman, and who was cut off from the family for 40 plus years. And then the rapprochement began a little bit because I went to see him. But what he told me, I have sort of written only about half of that, or less than half of that, because so much of it was about his bitterness and anger at the choices that he had made. And there were choices. But how do you understand choice in a moment like that when everything else dictates your choice? And then it goes on to influence your life. So I was shocked when he said those things to me. I had to listen. Then I decided that I'm not going to reveal them because he has to continue living that life. He has to live in the family, and many of them were in the family, about the family that he was living in. And if I was to put some truth out there, it would really impact that relationship. So that was my first lesson, and I kept coming up against this, and I'll give you a couple of other instances to explain it. One of them was to do with sexual violence. So when you start to hear stories of sexual violence, and especially from women who have lived through that experience, it's very, very difficult to talk, to see what to reveal and what not to reveal, because many of these people who told those stories to me did so in confidence because their own family members who were alive did not know that the mother or the aunt or whoever had been abducted, had been raped, had had children from that relationship, etc. And they said to me that one or two of the women said, please don't talk about this in such a way that it can reveal who we are, because our children don't know and it's going to break that relationship apart. I talked to a young researcher who was working on not for my work, but she was working on a very large partition project in which she had met a doctor who had stories to tell, and she kept pushing the doctor further and further because she knew that there was something she had heard, because these stories often become public secrets. You know, people around you know them, but you don't necessarily speak of them. And she said to me that, you know, when I used to go to see him, his wife was very upset with me at the ways in which I tried to get him to talk, and I couldn't understand it. And one day he did reveal the history that he had been hiding. And she couldn't cope with it, and he couldn't cope with it. And that's when she understood how and why his wife was so upset with her. Because the story was that as a doctor, he had been given the responsibility by his nurses and various other women in the hospital that if the hospital was attacked, they gave him a gun and said, you kill us. And at some point, he had had to perform that task. Now, you can imagine carrying that history, but you can also imagine what the telling of it to somebody who is not equipped to deal with the trauma that it'll unleash will do. So actually, there's a very, very fine balance that you have to tread, and nobody teaches you how to do it, because we enter this thing thinking it's a simple act of asking and listening and hearing and writing. It's not. You know, there are so many other things involved in it. So I had to make those choices, and the choices that I made, and that's why I call my book The Other Side of Silence, because there is so much that lies at the other side of silence, but silence is also a choice that you as writer make, that people as survivors make, and all of those silences have to be respected. But the agency that you have as a writer allows you to problematize that issue. So I have spoken extensively in my book about the pressures of silence, the need for silence, the importance of silence, and also the responsibility of the interviewer in what to silence and what to reveal. And I think if you talk about that, then people know that what they see on the page is not all there is. There must be more. And they have to read into that. And from your commentary, they can see that there may be more, but they can't link it to X or Y interview. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's no formula for it. You just have to kind of deal with it as
Yeah.
the material presents itself to you.
And I think that's why the complexity of the issue and the way you deal with it does not allow it to flatten itself, because sometimes these histories are often or can get into the risk of representational angle to it.
You do that, no? Ririti does that in the exhibition, because when you present, so if for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, there will be a story which comes to a point where the protagonist in the story has to make a choice. And the choice could be as simple, I'm saying as simple within quotation marks, as do you choose to leave or do you choose to stay? If you leave, there's a certain set of circumstances that will govern what happens to you. If you stay, and it wasn't an easy choice for people, because my uncle, for example, chose to stay. He said, I stayed. Why did I stay? I was 20 years old. Your mother was not married. My two married sisters didn't ask me to come to India. Here I had a home, and I stayed on in my home. It wasn't that he chose this country over that country. He just chose the reality he knew. And that carried a whole lot of consequences. So the Ririti exhibition, in the way
Yeah.
that you put those questions, each of those questions is really fraught and really complex. And it's a wonderful thing that I really like the way you did that.
Thank you. You. Coming to Sony, within your work, how do you make sure that these stories are not flattened? How do you retain that complexity?
Again, because the material is so sparse, I do not have that kind of constraint of, making only certain kinds of stories as representative stories. In fact, my strategy has been to take what I have or whatever stories I have to attract more stories. So, someone gave me 150 books, right? Someone else says, I'll give you 5 more. I'll give you 7 more. I'll give you, 100 more. And that's how it's probably turned out to be 800 to 900 more, right? So, in that sense, because there is not much material, I have not had to struggle that much around it. And in fact, people are so only after a certain number or a certain range will I be able to talk about representative text or materials. The other part is, yes, in certain senses, I do not digitize everything very obviously because there is one book in and there are multiple copies. So I have the luxury to say no to the digitization of other copies. In fact, I'm actually a very big fan because I think having both the copies digitized makes sense because of the marginalia, the notes that the previous readers must have made. But in certain cases, because of lack of resources and things like that, I do make that decision. But it has not been it's I don't think it has hampered the voices and the books and the stories in any way.
Coming back to you, Urvashi, and taking from what you spoke, how has gendered violence impacted the way we understand partition and what within that is often silenced?
So I think we know now today, it's been some 20, 25 years of a lot of really extensive research on violence. That has gone beyond the Punjab, also gone to the East and looked at how partition unfolded differently in the East, but gone beyond that to look at Sindh, to look at Gujarat, to look at Ladakh, Kashmir, the northeastern states, Assam, the entire history was, and now the work you're doing, Mysore, Hyderabad, Bangalore, a little bit. So Pune, places where we think these histories did not unfold. Bombay, which was a city which is really reshaped by partition. So in a sense, in all this work, I think one of the things that has stood out is how central both gender and caste were to the ways, to the experience of partition and to the ways in which that experience unfolded over the months. So, since your question is to do with gender, then I'll address that. We also know now from different kinds of research that one of the ways in which the gendered experience unfolded was the mass rape or sexual violation, sexual assault on women of both communities and of other communities who weren't necessarily centrally involved. You know, the Christians, Catholic nuns in Kashmir, or the Parsis, or the Sikhs, and so on, other than the Hindus and the Muslims. So the mass abduction and mass rape, and also the ways in which both the Indian and Pakistani states reacted to that, gives us a very interesting understanding of how the state deals with gender. Because even while India and Pakistan were fighting over dividing everything, that is, how do we divide arms and ammunition depots? How do we divide the currency? How do we divide administrative files? How do we divide bank accounts? How do we deal with pensions? How do we deal with petrol, trains, train lines, rivers, you name it? That everything was being fought over, books also. which libraries would get which
Yes.
books and everything. There's that iconic picture
Picture.
of
Yes.
this poor man sitting there with all the books thinking, what
Yes.
should I do? But they got together very early on, I think as early as September of 1947, to talk about what was happening to women. And they took account of the mass abductions, and they decided to create two sets of people made up of women social workers, police, magistrates, etc., who had the power to go into each other's countries to find women who had been abducted. And then they would bring these women back to what they call their natural, within quotes, home, which basically meant that Hindu women were brought to India and Muslim women were taken to Pakistan. And as the way in which law works, they created a law, and they created an ordinance that later became an act, and they put a date that after 1st of March 1947, any person, woman or child, found to be living in the company of somebody, man of the other religion, will be assumed to have been abducted, no matter that the woman might be 48 years old and might have been living with that man for a long time. So that gender was central that way. It was also very important in the ways in which, to deal with refugees, it was largely women through women's organizations. And I'm talking of Delhi and the north, but in the east it was different, except there were women's organizations there also, to deal with the refugee crisis. So here in the north, the All India Women's Conference and a whole range of other women. In the east, it was women associated with the communist movement, with an organization called Mahila Atma Raksha Samiti and others, who basically helped to look after the refugees, set up refugee camps, etc. Came into what is be known as care work. And then the states took on, the large number of women who were rendered single because their husbands were killed, widows whose husbands disappeared, women who did not manage to marry because of the trauma of the time. And all these women were, within quotes, rehabilitated by the state through being trained in centers that the state set up to do stitching. And the job of making uniforms for class 4 government employees was given to these women, because when the colonial masters went, the uniforms changed from those fancy white and with the pagdi and the kamarband into something resembling the safari suit and the Gandhi topi. And those were stitched by women in these centers. And so the rehabilitation of women also was taken up by the state in a variety of ways. So all of these are just some ways that have begun to open up for us to understand how how the gendered impact of partition unfolded. And it wasn't always only negative, because for many women, they managed to, shorn of all the responsibilities of the family, they could make a life for themselves. So many women said, we actually spread our wings. But the tragedy is that it takes something as traumatic as partition to give women the opportunity that they should have in normal life anyway. So I think I don't know if this is the question you were asking, but
Also, building on that, in the present situation, in the present context, in the political tensions which India and our neighbors are facing, how do you see partition being understood, retold, and remembered? This question is for both of you.
Partition silencing we talked about, but told, retold. I think in the case of Sindhi, the situation is that as I keep calling it, Sindhi is a partitioned literature, right? We have a substantial body of, say, Punjabi literature on both sides of the border, and Bengali literature on both sides of the border. The script has divided the community so much that even Sindhi experts within India, whether they are, there are two kinds of experts. One are enthusiasts of Perso-Arabic script. The other set is the Devanagari script, and it has been very, very, disturbing, because they don't see eye to eye. they think that, we should now assimilate with Devanagari related languages, because that is what will make us look like Indians. And it's not a new thing. It happened immediately after independence. They said that the British institutionalized Perso-Arabic script on Sindhi. Now we should revert to Devanagari. But actually, there was no such thing as only Devanagari. There were, I think, at least 6 scripts, because the British could not make sense of, the account books and things like that. They wanted to standardize something, right? So in that sense, it continues to be, a case of partition. So the scope of partition in these cases needs to be seen as an ongoing thing. And if we do not talk about script in that sense, if we do not talk about these other kinds of damages that have happened in that sense, we will not, really be able to do, justice to the idea of, let's talk about partition. That's why I'm approaching partition through books and book histories, because through these mediums, you arrive at something else. So what is it that is, why did this happen, then why did this happen, and maybe with that people will be able to talk about partition. So let's start with what we have and then see what has been silenced and what needs to be retold and what needs to be told and what needs to be processed.
Sony is writing about a book by a Sindhi writer that we have just published. It's the first Sindhi novel by a Sindhi woman. And it came out, Sony went for in mid or 48 or what? Oh, 20s, yeah. And then it was republished with a slightly different name, and now it's been translated into English. And it's a very interesting novel, because what it is about is a Hindu-Muslim romance and marriage. And that is part of the reason why it's also was kind of wiped out of memory. But to know that it was possible at that time to write, and that this story that Gul Sadarangani writes is based on something that she must have known in her life. I think that's the answer to your question, about remembering partition. How is it remembered today, etc. My thing is, it's 75 years, right? There are 2 countries, there are 3 countries. The separation of Pakistan and Bangladesh in 1971 was terrible and really bloody separation. And yet those 2 countries are now talking to each other. They might have moments when they are, when there's some certain enmity rears its head, because the political moment happens all the time. But they can travel to each other's countries, they recognize each other's existence, etc. Why is it so difficult for us to understand that there is another country, okay, forget the way it was born, etc., and we really just need to recognize that and accept it? I think that's one thing. The second thing is, I think that we need to talk much more about partition, because the way in which we make enemies of each other helps to raise or give credence to a lot of stereotypes, myths, untruths, the whole works. When we meet with each other, we're just people. And we're just people who can talk to each other, who have so much in common, and then yet our histories have grown in different ways. And one of the reasons, I think, is also because we have never talked about partition in the way that we are doing now, but through our history. We have never talked, whenever you've seen programs on television, they've been about the political stuff, Indus Water Treaty, all of that. But you haven't had people across the border talking to each other. There's been no acknowledgement, for example, that the violence was never one-sided. So if both of us could be capable of such violence on each other, can we not confront it and sit down and talk about it? Can we not think how we can live with our differences and continue to move into the future as 2 independent countries? Can we not travel to each other's countries? Why is it so difficult? Why is I want to go and see Takshila. Why can't I see it? I want to go and see the Harappa civilization. It's not possible for me to see it. You're a historian. I mean, how can you sort of forget that? So, in a sense, I think we really need to talk about these things and not demonize each other. And I think there's not enough effort going into that. But this is not the, I mean, this must be the 100th time I've said that. So I feel like a stuck record. But
Talking about efforts, how do you both see storytelling and the merit which storytelling holds, especially carrying the humanized and personal stories across, both the borders, uh, three borders, go beyond, say, literature or archives, or even pedagogy? How do you foresee that in the coming, for the coming generation, where it can be not something which they just blindly inherit, but they question what is given to them, and how do they take it forward?
You're asking about new formats, or you're asking about
Both. Besides, what is the merit of storytelling, and how does storytelling help, and what are the different forms in which you have come across? So both.
I think this is a moment when we could, show the clips that I had planned to. So, in terms of what kind of interesting work is happening, I do not see a lot of people coming up with the agenda of let's make an archive necessarily. What they are also doing is we have this, what can we do with it? So they approach the entire question from the point of view of content, and in some cases it works, in some cases it really works, because rather than watching or browsing cat or dog images, you're looking at something else on the internet, right? So I think in in some of the cases I've just brought 4 images for us to see, because these are very Sindhi related, and I'm sure there is a lot more work happening, because Sindhi cuisine is being taken a lot more seriously now, Sindhi folk is being taken a lot more seriously. I'm just showing you some glimpses of what kind of efforts I have seen in an interesting way coming up. One would be one is an animation film. Nina Sabnani at IIT Bombay made this short animation film, and it's sort of located in Sindh, right? Fun to watch. Nobody thought you would talk about partition through, or a partition story through animation. So it's a very very fun genre to look at. The story is also very soothing. It's not going to torture you. It's not going to haunt you, but it's a very nice watch. And it also tells you, again, you come up with something that you already know, already have, and then you make something out of it. You try to make sense out of it. The logic behind this is she has used the quilt design that women have traditionally been working with, and this is an animation entirely based on the quilt based designs. Yeah. The next image, this person is a very young boy, Diary of a Sindhi boy. The Instagram handle is called Sindhi Diary, and he writes about random things that he knows of. So he is someone who is doing his masters. His name is Karan Vani, and he's based in Sri Ganganagar. Brilliant in the sense that he thinks that his grandmother passed on certain things to him. They intentionally spoke Sindhi at home, so he knows a lot about the logic behind rituals and cuisines and recipes and things like that. And he feels like sharing them. So he's in a way archiving. So social media becomes a mode of archiving. So sometimes he comes up with things like depictions of friendship in, Sindhi literature. Or what are the places in which you will find references to X in Sindhi literature, or Y in Sindhi literature. Or he gives you a new logic about why this festival is being celebrated. So this is one interesting way of looking at it through the angle of content. Yeah. The next one is this is of course not coming from a Sindhi, but very recently it came up. She has on this website, the Migrant Story, blogged about Ulhasnagar, and she's spoken about what are the things she sees in Ulhasnagar. So she's looking at it from the doctor's point of view. A lot of the people she's describing are non-Sindhis, which is in a way my latest oral history project about, because Sindhis are leaving Ulhasnagar for all kinds of reasons, and I'm trying to document why. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at an oral history of a refugee city So she's not, and in a way this adds to that, because a lot of people that she's talking to are not, Sindhi. Of course, it's one blog. I hope there are many more blogs to follow in which she will talk to us more, I mean, in greater detail about the Sindhi aspect of it. But it's now taken for granted that Ulhasnagar is no longer a Sindhi city the way it used to be, right? So this is one blog. So you approach it from the point of view of, I know these 2-3 stories. Can I write a blog about it? Yeah. And finally, there is one more. This is a short film that some college students came together to make. Okay, and what they did was, they picked up a story. They're sort of so naive. They would not get into the idea of adaptation, and what adaptation is. You should give a proper credit to the author and things like that. Nothing. It was just a project. It seems like that, and they made a film out of it. Right. So I think people are coming across a story and finding a way to make it their own. So whether it is a blog or an Instagram handle or a short story or quilt, people are trying to come up with interesting ways to say, hey, I mean, this is one way in which I have created something out of it. What do you think? So these are some examples that I have in mind regarding interesting stuff happening.
I think the last one also was very nice. I've seen that. And even the Mukund and Riya's also is a very nice animated film. Would definitely recommend people to watch these two. The others I also will watch.
But how do we watch them?
The movies
It's
are on
the
YouTube.
Insta.
That's why the
I mean,
screenshot
okay.
was an
Okay.
it's
Insta
on
handle is on
YouTube
Insta.
and Insta.
And the article is on the Migrant Story
On
website.
them. Great.
Urvashi, have you come across anything, and what do you look at? What are the future ways of engaging? You as a publisher, constantly working with these stories on ground with young people. How do you see the trend changing in terms of consumption of these stories?
So I think actually there is a lot happening in different fields, and as Sony, these few examples also indicate, your own work shows. So there is a lot happening in the field of animation. There is a great deal happening in the field of art with young artists who are third generation artists from the different countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and also from different regions in our country, who are producing works of art. And often these are centered on family histories. Then there are films. There's a whole range of films that have been done, some of which were showed here also. I think at one time, there's that film that starts off with tracing the father's journey as a hockey player and ends up being film about partition. Then there is another film that looks at an archive that somebody, a partition survivor, held and traces that journey of that archive. So there's a whole range of those things happening. There was a while ago, very, very interesting cross-country exercise done by a group of graphic artists, mostly young graphic artists, where they collaborated on telling these histories jointly. And you would have somebody doing the visuals and another person doing the text and talking. It's resulted in a rather wonderful book called This Side, That Side. So I think there's that, and there's also the fact that you get a lot of youngsters from South Asia, particularly partitioned countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who are in Europe, in America, in the UK, and who are making connections there. And the ways of connecting are through stories. And of course, I don't know if you remember that story which was on Google long ago about connecting two grandfathers as a way of advertising Google Maps, but it was quite a moving and nicely put together stories. So I think there's so much potential because we have the possibility of accessing stories not only in the way that stories were traditionally accessed, which is one, handed down orally, and two, written and shared through publication. But now you have all the mediums that you've talked about through which stories can be shared, they can be transformed, they can be made more interesting. And they can reach out to people. And then we have the possibility of games also. Like Leo thing, there could be so much more that can be done to keep this history alive, or to at least have it as a subject of discussion, even if it may not enter the curriculum. But it is there as a story that, or as a history that that is so rich to learn from. So, and the museums are there as well.
In fact, I'm glad you brought up the South Asian diaspora outside India. Our exhibition, The Undivided Identity, has worked with 8 such young people from Glasgow and India who were involved in the research and the creative outputs. And some of their own histories are also part of the larger narrative. So that's another way of engaging them. And it was very different to see the way they have absorbed and understand partition versus a student here. And also, as you said, in Pakistan, where if we remove the political labels, we are just the same people. We had histories, millenniums. We share the same history. One of the students in our workshop, mentioned that I didn't know that we were so similar. This was a workshop which was done with students from Pakistan and India, and it was very. It was an eye opener for them to see that it's very similar. What is this big fight? And as you said, rightly said, that can't we acknowledge the differences and move past it? Um, One last question with regards to your work. If a young person comes to um, see your work and is encountering partition for the first time through your work, what is that one thing you would want them to leave with?
If you come across any of my archives, any of my projects, try and ask yourself what is not there, and how will you make it a lot more accessible. So this is where I think very seriously about pedagogy as well. Do not listen to my narrative or my version of partition story and partition history, rather than create maybe one blog, one Wikipedia article. Work with me on OCR. Try and figure out what those texts are saying. How will this Perso-Arabic script make sense to other people? How will you make it available through transliteration into Devanagari and Roman script for the international diaspora? Uh, can you do at least one interview for me, not just for me but for yourself as well? So what are the ways in which you will not just consume the story? What are the ways in which you can contribute? So if that is something that excites someone to understand it as it is, that will be a great way, a takeaway from the project.
I don't think I can answer that question, because one thing is a really tough thing to talk about. But what I'm going to do is subvert your question a little bit, give you a kind of answer to it, and use the opportunity of having the mic to tell a little story, since we were talking about stories. So I would say that for young people, maybe something that might be interesting is, history lives inside all our families. So it doesn't have to be partition history. I would say, talk to people in your family, talk to your grandparents, talk to your parents, and see what of their histories can you find, recover through conversation, through the materials that they may have in their personal collections. Often interesting things come up. And that itself is an opening that might lead you to other things. But to your earlier comment about how alike we are, and how the students who attended the workshop said they were so similar. So there's 2 bits of this story that I want to tell. The very first time I went to Lahore, I went with the friends that I went with. Some friends of mine from Pakistan. And we went off to a particular shop to buy dry fruit. North Indians are obsessed with akroat and all those kinds of things. And we think that the closer you get to Afghanistan, the better they are in quantity or quality. So I went off to a shop to buy figs and whatnot. And we were communicating with a shopkeeper in Punjabi. We bought the stuff. And there was another man in the shop who was around, and then he left. Then when I went to pay for it, the shopkeeper said, "No, there's no charge." And I said, "Why is there no charge?" He said, "You know, that man who was there, he was listening to you. And when he left, he told me that the Punjabi she's speaking is from my land. So I want to gift this to her, but I don't want her to know who I am. So I'm just paying you." And he just left, this completely unknown man, left me this gift because of the connection we had over a language of what was originally his home. And now I was in his other home. The reverse of that is a story that I have heard. I do not know if it is true, but it is utterly charming, which is that at one time there was, when India Pakistan used to play cricket matches in each other's countries, there was a match held in a place called Mohali, which is next to Chandigarh. And the chief minister of that time, chief minister of Punjab at that time, was Amarinder Singh, the Congress minister who was there and is no longer there. He issued visas, apparently 4,000 of them, to Pakistanis, and 4,000 people came across the border to attend the match and had a great time. And then he threw a party in a big maidan for everybody, where there was lots of food and lots of drink. So there was an alcohol counter and there was a food counter, and anybody who had a ticket to the cricket match was invited to the party. So again, thousands of people came. And apparently the whole city of Mohali was decorated to welcome the Pakistani guests. Shopkeepers stayed open till late, gave them things on discounts, etc., etc. Then the party happened and lots of people went. And at some point in the party, a whole range of somewhat drunken men established themselves on the stage where the chief minister was sitting with his supporters and others, and said to him in Punjabi that, "Sir, this is the best party that we have attended. Now we are issuing you an invitation. You come to Pakistan and you stand for election. We'll make you win, but you must throw parties like this." So that's the kind of camaraderie that there is in a good moment.
Thank you, Urvashi and Soni, for such a rich and layered conversation. Yeah, could you please identify yourselves and address the question you're asking to the person?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jayant, and I used to do research similar to you guys on, but rather on political sociology of religion. And one of the research we were doing across 2 years, where we were documenting Indo-Portuguese identity with regards to partition and Christianity. So we noticed a lot of masking that would happen. They wouldn't let us. Um, they didn't they didn't invite us because we were Indians, and we noticed there's a lot of bitterness that happens, like how ma'am was mentioning, when she was interviewing her uncle, that he has those bitter memories of the partition. I wanted to know, like, how would we tackle as outsiders when you come across this situation where you can't push them too much. There are a lot of things you can't share, like how you mentioned. And obviously, there's a political will that follows as to what to document history, what to archive, because it can lead to a lot of friction with pluralistic identities. So, how do we navigate this as researchers?
What is the location of your interviews, if I may ask?
They were across Daman and Diu. So we noticed that both the regions had different identities in itself, with relation to India and Portuguese itself, and how they viewed each other despite having shared languages. And within the language, they had different divide itself. They were not open to, if you had a pastor come who was not part of the community, they felt they were outsiders. They were very protective of their identity. So I wanted to know, like, how do we bridge this as researchers? And how do we stay objective?
I had a very interesting conversation some time back when Sindhi Halchal Archive was being exhibited here. The suggestion was, the question asked to me was, do I have to be off or from or belong to the community in order to do research on Sindhis? And because I'm not a Sindhi, does that mean I will never be able to do that? So I am not sure that, if this is something that entitles me to, get maybe a foot in someone's home. But I'm sure you have already tried befriending the local people and things like that. I think it takes time. I unfortunately do not have another answer, because you will not be able to force answers out of anyone. But maybe if you do some sort of meta thinking around the process itself, that commentary becomes foundation for research. That comment, so if by collecting certain quotes that people have said, in itself becomes your, like, we will not talk to you or we are suspicious of you, in itself is a way to maybe blog about it in the first instance, so you make sense of what is open to you or is getting revealed to you, and then you see if someone else can be nudged, and then someone else can be nudged. How many years has it been for you? Ah,
reason it took us 2 years was because it took 1 year just to to create that trust with them. And then it took another year of interviews and constant visiting, to create that trust and let them into their houses and have them open up about their understanding of, how they view this multicultural identity within Daman and Diu, and how they relate this conflict of identity. Are you an Indian? Are you a Portuguese?
right.
What do you want to do with your language when you have, how are you going to pass it on to your children when it's declining so much? So it took us that long. But where I was coming from is what we noticed when we spoke to, the collectors or the politicians there, that we noticed that it requires a political will as well to document this, to archive this, because like I said, it creates it has a possibility of creating friction based on what they say. So
Right.
how do we as researchers ensure that these identities are documented?
Right. So maybe I'll just leave you with one small, note of, I don't know, despair or consolation. PG Sindhi Library began in 2016, and it sort of saw some form in 2023. So even when it comes to objects, which was, simple case of putting it under a scanner and digitizing and all that, it took me 2016 to 2023. So maybe 2 years is a very, maybe from now your questions will be different and your site will be different in the sense of the material that you're working with, and probably that will open up some more doors. But yes, it takes time and there is no easy way.
I think you answered your question yourself, actually, because you've talked of all the things that are key: building trust, taking time, etc. And I think the one thing that you said that I wanted to respond to, one question you said, how do we remain objective? I don't think you can, and I don't think there's any need to do that. A different, more important question for me would be, how do we remain empathetic? And how do we then, as researchers, represent that history as both complex, multi-layered, and often contradictory in the ways in which different ways tell it, different people tell it. I don't think that we have solved that problem of, should history be told only in one voice or should it be told in multiple voices? And what if these voices contradict each other? But I don't think that there is a solution, because history is lived, experienced differently by different people, and they'll tell it in different voices. Sometimes the problem is that as researchers who step into this, apart from the issues that you are outlining of outsider, insider, and so on, is that we don't have the time, because if you're doing academic research, you're on a timetable, whereas people's lives are not on that timetable. And that sets up a kind of contradiction and a friction. And we actually, we don't know how to deal with that. Either you can try to subvert your academic timetable, but you can't really push people to speak to you faster than they want to speak to you. So that, I think, is the problem, with no easy solution. But otherwise, I think that you yourself, in talking about trust and talking about time and talking about objectivity, etc., have actually thought about and responded to your own question.
My name is Anuhita. Thanks to all three of you for a really engaging session. My question is for you, Urvashi. Your body of work has informed and expanded the understanding of so many of us. So thank you for that as well. I want to look at some of the things which you said, which all three of you, but the question is to you. You were talking about understanding across countries, and you were also talking about the official versus the emotional understanding of partition. But we are living in a time where within our country, we're seeing a million partitions. And some of these are being instituted by the official narrative, which is also using emotion as a tool. So in that context, what to go back to the title of this discussion, there's a responsibility and honesty. What would that mean?
Well, Anahita, I think further question to that, additional question would be whose responsibility and honesty, right? So I think as researchers, we at least can exercise our responsibility, honesty, and ethics in relation to the histories we are exploring. But many of us are aware that we are doing this against an overarching context, which is pushing with power a different narrative, a kind of unitary narrative, in which, well, we know that that narrative, we don't actually need to elaborate on it, but even the declaration of something like Partition Horrors Remembrance Day, speaks to that narrative. So, what can we do with our limited capacities and our limited power? I think is to work in the spaces that we know best to work in, whether they be academic spaces, whether they be civil society spaces. So, if Ririti can get the kind of complex narratives that they are presenting and even the 4 stories they have in their exhibition, if they can get those narratives to become a part of extracurricular teaching or activities in schools, I think it's something of an attempt to make a difference and to inflect the overarching narrative with a different story. I think if we are doing research which also tries to tell and explore with honesty different stories, we don't need to necessarily carry the responsibility of that research intervening in activism or action right away. But the building of that knowledge base means at least there is another knowledge base that is there. And possibly someday it will become a source of action or at least of understanding our histories better. I don't know what more we can do, but I think the smallness of what we do should not put us off the importance of doing it and the seriousness with which we must do it. Does that at all answer your question?
My question is to Sony. There is a famous bakery called Karachi Bakery. I think many people do not know that it originates from Sindhi businessmen. Do you see that bakery as a symbol of hope in future, like bridging the gap of not even the Sindhi people, also the partition?
Which location are you talking about?
I think it's there in every cities, right? Even in Bangalore.
Karachi
And
Bakery.
it's very famous, I guess.
Right. That's because I thought of, I'm very mindful of Karachi, all things Karachi. That's because if you are running, say, for example, a sweet shop in Mumbai that's called Karachi, it's possible that you will be shut down. And there are places, I mean, in Ulhasnagar, there was for a very long time, and I hope there still is, Karachi Hindu Hotel, which used to give all, prepare all kinds of delicacies, things like that. So, yes, Karachi Bakery might be one of those instances where the name and the freedom to, name your own business after another entity exists. So yes, it's a discourse of hope. It's a space for hope. But I have seen other kinds of stories happening where people were asked to shut down or change their name because why is this city being used in this city?
So, my name is Ahalya Sriram, and I've been following Rarite's work for a long time and got inspired to look at history, museums in a different angle through the programs that they offer. So, I mean, I'm pretty glad that I came to this panel discussion as well. So, thanks all of you for your authentic sharing and the experiences and the research that you bring into this space, especially so much relatable to the voice that you are silenced. So my question is, how do you, I mean, all three of you would have come across situations where you have not expected that when you started your work, as you have all also mentioned in this conversation. How do you deal with those things, right? Like, it's not easy to kind of expect something that was unexpected, and how do you deal with it and continue working in this space despite knowing that you had to silence these things for whatever ethical reason?
I don't think that you easily make peace with it. But I think that a dose of realism never did anybody any harm. And if that's the only way you can function, you rather than saying, I'm not going to do this at all, rather than saying, I'm going to stop, you ask yourself, okay, I can do only this limited thing. Is it worth doing or not? And are there ways that I can find, which I have not yet explored, which might allow me to do more? And I think that there are always ways. There are always things when you put your mind to it. Because, if you recall when when Tejasvi asked me, how did you start work, etc., I mentioned that once I started work, I began to see Delhi in a different way because I could see the history in Delhi, which I had earlier ignored. I used to live in a place in Delhi called Jangpura. And Jangpura is largely a refugee colony, which I never knew when I was living there. But later, when I started doing the work, I saw it. And then what you were just saying, every second shop was called Lahoriyan Di Hatti, Karachi shoes, etc., etc. And in the Gurdwara in Jangpura, there was and still is every year a memorial ceremony to the survivors of the violence in Rawalpindi. Now, these things became apparent to me when I trained a different lens on the same city, which I thought I knew like the back of my hand, but clearly I didn't know it. So I think that when you're pushed against the wall and you don't know how much space you have, the choice I would make is, and may not be a peaceful choice, that I will continue to function in the little space I have, but I will continue to explore. If there are other spaces and other things that I have not found, maybe I can work through those. For example, I'm not an artist, but if I was an artist, I would think of art as a possible way of exploring those histories. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, hello all. As my name is Devashree. I am a Bengali. So I have a question not to you. I have a question for all. That recently, when I speak in Bengali, it's telling that it's a trend that it's Bangladeshi. So how we can resist this? Or should we resist, or should not resist? Because I am a family where my family suffered this entire partition, and this is entire political, and currently also this political play card they're playing. So what should be our responsibility in this such a situation? How we can resist?
I'll tell you what has sort of worked or even not worked for Sindhis in Ulasnagar, right? I mean, we are on the one hand seen as a community that knows Marathi very well. on the other hand, we are, seen as people who are too stubborn to learn anything which is not Sindhi. So, in that sense, that sort of adaptability, that sort of flexibility to be able to speak, and relate and communicate in more than one language, I think is one interesting resource that a community or a person can have. Yes, it's unfair, but even a, broken attempt at speaking something makes some, the so-called son of the soil rethink that this person is actually a Bangalorean and not necessarily Bengali/Bangladeshi. And this is going to be the case, which is why partition and minority histories are so fascinating to read about. Because if you are not, speaking, say, a certain majority language in a, city, then you are bound to be categorized into, certain ways. And that's how stereotypes emerge. And Sindhis have been victims of very serious stereotyping. So no very clear answer, but this is what Sindhi community has been doing, if it helps.
Thank you very much, Urvashi and Soni, for taking us through this journey of how we can carry on the responsibility of, taking these voices honestly and with care and courage to the next generation. And thank you all of the audiences to be part of this and come on a Saturday on a festival day. And thank you once again.